He thought she was going to kill him. Her shadow blotted out the moonlight, her tomahawk still dripping blood. But instead, she just stared, eyes like flint, voice low and trembling. "I haven't had sex in 6 months," she said, almost like a confession or a warning. The boy, barely 16, trembling, untouched by war or woman, felt something shift. This wasn't a seduction. It was a reckoning. And by morning, neither of them would be the same. Not after what the soldiers did. Not after what she made him do. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The boy was face down in the gravel when the hawk screamed overhead, a thin, reedy sound swallowed by the vast, breathless heat. His lips were cracked open, whispering a fevered prayer, each syllable brittle as the dust caking his teeth. "Yea, though I walk, yea, though I." The riverbed had long dried up, nothing but bone, white stone, and rattlesnake coils left behind. His hands were blistered raw, denim split open at the knees, Bible pages stuffed in his shirt to keep warm through the desert nights. Wes Calder, 16, a boy still stitched to the idea of salvation, lay limp and baking, eyes closed against the merciless Sunday. That's when the shadow swallowed him. Broad shoulders blocked the light, and silence hung in the air like judgment. A figure knelt. The boots were worn rawhide, thick straps over weather-hardened calves. A tomahawk swung from the hip. She studied him, this collapsed thing at her feet, then crouched low and slipped calloused fingers beneath his armpits. No ceremony, no warning. She lifted him like a sack of meat, one arm across her shoulder. He groaned. Once, delirious. "Mama?" But she said nothing. Her breath came slow and deep as a mountain wind. War paint ran in muddy streaks across her face, blue and ochre smeared in jagged lines. Blood dried on her left forearm, cracked like dried clay. She didn't bother checking if he was conscious, didn't ask who he was. The boy weighed nothing to her, just another warm body the desert tried to eat and failed to digest. As she moved, her moccasins stirred dust ghosts that clung to her calves. Vultures circled high above, curious, disappointed. She marched west, her silhouette long against the rising slope, heat waves dancing off her shoulders. Behind them, the dry river twisted like a dead snake through the basin. He faded in and out, catching snatches of his father's voice. "Don't ever cross the border, boy." And then flames. Always flames. He remembered the smell of gunpowder and hair, horses screaming. His lips moved again, soundless. A tear streaked sideways across his dirt-caked face. She didn't glance down. She didn't care about his tears. She cared about shade and water, and whether the cave by the canyon mouth hadn't yet been picked clean by coyotes. The trail narrowed, and she shifted him higher on her back without breaking stride. His head lolled over her shoulder. In that strange, flickering, half-conscious state, Wes noticed her scent, smoke, leather, something wild and bitter like pine sap and blood. They passed a cluster of stones where a child's moccasin lay half-buried. She didn't stop. The canyon cut into the earth like a wound, and that's where she took him, where the wind didn't bite so hard and the hawks couldn't see them. She laid him on a nest of pine needles beside a fire scar, stripped a hide blanket from a bundle and threw it over him. He coughed. She poured water from a gourd into his mouth, forcing him to drink even as he choked. His eyes fluttered open, blurry. He saw her face for the first time, broad-cheeked, eyes dark and unreadable. She didn't blink, didn't offer comfort, just watched. The tomahawk glinted beside her knee. She picked it up, tested its weight, then returned to her silence, sitting at the cave's edge as the sky turned copper behind her. Night crept in slow. Coyotes howled from the ridge. Wes closed his eyes, not sure if he'd wake again. Wes awoke to the sound of metal on stone, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a clock ticking in reverse. His eyes cracked open to pale firelight licking the cave walls, shadows stretching long and skeletal across rock. The smell of smoke and leather clung to everything. He shifted slightly and winced. Pain tore down his back like a lash. She was there, seated cross-legged near the entrance, hunched over her tomahawk, dragging its blade in slow arcs across a whetstone. Her face was expressionless, her eyes catching glints of firelight, unblinking. Not guard duty, no. She wasn't afraid. She was watching him, measuring him, Wes turned his face away, heart pounding like a snare drum. Asterisk. She's going to kill me. She's just waiting till I can walk again. Asterisk. His hand instinctively searched for his Bible, but it was gone. Only a scrap of paper remained under his chest, damp with sweat and blood. He closed his eyes. Asterisk. Forgive me, Father. I didn't mean to. Asterisk. But the memories came anyway. The boot, the scream, that girl running with her hair on fire, shot in the back. His voice rose unbidden in his skull times. Stop them! I was yelling stop, asterisk, but he hadn't yelled. He'd just watched. Something wet touched his lip. He flinched her hand, holding a gourd. She tilted it carefully, and warm water trickled into his mouth. He swallowed greedily, choking once, coughing into his chest. She waited until he finished, then dropped something on the blanket beside him, a strip of dried bison meat, curled and brown. He shook his head, stomach twisting. She went back to sharpening. The scraping started again. Wes tried to sit up, groaned, and laid back down. The blanket itched. His mind flickered. Flash campfire. Flash soldiers' laughter. Flash, we don't take prisoners. He gritted his teeth. Asterisk, I just delivered the books. I never touched a weapon. Asterisk. But then the image of the boy returned. Apache, maybe 10, crouched behind a horse. He'd locked eyes with Wes for a second, before the bullet tore through his temple. Asterisk, I didn't shoot. I didn't shoot. I didn't. Asterisk. The tomahawk hissed again on stone. Wes looked at her. She wasn't watching him now. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something far outside the cave. The wind howled low through the canyon, a sound like weeping. The fire popped. He studied her thick braids knotted with feathers, her arms like stone pillars, muscles carved from survival. Scars, dozens of them, one along her collarbone, one by her jaw. She could snap his neck if she wanted. So why hadn't she? Why had she carried him here? The silence pressed down, heavy as grief. Wes opened his mouth. Why'd you? She turned her head slightly. He stopped. Her eyes were back on him now. Steady. Cool. Like she was still deciding what he was worth. He thought of his father's last sermon. God sees through every mask a man wears. Wes felt naked. Asterisk. She sees me. Asterisk. Not as a boy. Not as a soldier. As something between. Something not yet. Forgiven. She reached into her pouch, pulled out a small bone carving, and set it near the fire, shaped like a wolf. A warning? A prayer? He didn't know. But he didn't ask. He just lay there, wide-eyed, the scrape of her blade counting down to something he didn't understand yet. And outside, the stars blinked down like silent witnesses. The fire cracked low, casting orange tongues across the cave walls, their shadows dancing like spirits stirred from sleep. Wes sat hunched beneath the weight of the silence, knees drawn up under the scratchy blanket, fingers pressed tight around a stone he'd picked up off the cave floor just to feel something solid. His wounds had stopped bleeding, but his mind hadn't. He hadn't spoken since she'd given him water again at dusk. Now, the night was full, heavy, vast, an ocean of stars outside the cave mouth, and Tohana hadn't moved except to toss another dry log on the fire, never once glancing his way. Her tomahawk rested beside her leg, close but untouched, as if it no longer mattered whether he tried to run. The crackle of the fire became unbearable, too loud in the space between them. He licked his lips, voice trembling in his throat. Why didn't you kill me? It came out softer than he intended, barely above a whisper. She didn't react. Not at first. Her eyes remained on the flames, but the corner of her jaw flexed just once, like a knot tightening. Then, slowly, she turned her head. The firelight carved her face in angles and shadows, the ochre paint half faded from sweat, her braids loose and hanging like ropes down her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, guttural, shaped by wind and smoke. I haven't had sex in 6 months. Wes blinked. The words struck him harder than a slap. He stared at her, mouth parting, unsure if he'd heard right. What? What? He croaked. His cheeks burned. He looked away, then back, but she hadn't laughed. She wasn't joking. Her expression was carved from iron, yet beneath it shimmered something stranger, something unspoken, even fragile. 6 months, she repeated, not for his benefit, but like a woman marking time. The silence between them deepened, thickened. Wes could feel the heat of the fire on his arms and the cold of her eyes on his skin. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. He realized that. Her words weren't an invitation. They were a wound. She sat with her legs folded, spine straight, a pillar of stillness while everything inside him trembled. He opened his mouth again, but no words came. What do you say to something like that? He could feel the boy in him shrinking. The boy who'd never touched a woman, who'd clutched a Bible tighter than a rifle, who'd looked away while people burned. She turned back to the fire. It was the last time, before they came, she murmured. Before they took the drums, before they buried the moonlight in our women's throats. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. This wasn't about desire. It was a marker of time, of grief, of stolen things. Her words were part of something older than English, something ritualistic, sacred even, twisted now by war. She had looked death in the face, and he was still crawling away from it. I didn't mean to be there, Wes said weakly. I didn't know what they were going to do. She glanced at him again, not with anger, not even pity, with silence, deliberate and weighty, as if his words were nothing new, as if she'd heard them before, from men who cried afterward, from boys who buried their own shame in forgetting. She smirked, then barely, but it wasn't cruel. It was knowing, testing. Her eyes held no hunger, only memory. She wasn't offering herself. She was offering truth, the kind that scars. And Wes, heart pounding like war drums, didn't know yet whether he could carry it. They walked in silence beneath a sky bleached bone-white by the desert sun, the air dry as flint and crueler than judgment. Tohana led, barefoot and sure-footed, her shoulders broad as oxen and unmoved by heat or sorrow, her tomahawk now strapped across her back like a memory too heavy to carry by hand. Wes followed, legs aching, sweat stinging his eyes, a dull throb pulsing in his temples as each step pulled him deeper into the burned-out remains of what once must have been a village. The path wound through blackened brush and ash-dusted stones, where wind kicked up little whirlwinds of soot and bone fragments that skittered like insects across the trail. His stomach turned as they passed a split cradle, charred black and half-buried in the sand, its tiny wooden ribs cracked open like a rib cage. Tohana didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence was everywhere. The cavalry had come through 3 days ago, and what they'd left behind wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard. Burned tents flapped in the wind like ruined flags. Scorched cooking pots lay overturned beside hearths now cold forever. A child's shoe rested in a pool of dried blood that had soaked into the ground and turned the dust to rust. Wes slowed, then stopped. Breath caught somewhere between shame and nausea. He recognized the pattern scorched into the buckskin tent flap, the same one he'd glimpsed days earlier from behind a wagon wheel, too cowardly to look directly. He'd been with them. He hadn't pulled the trigger. No. He hadn't taken a torch to the bedrolls or ripped women from their homes. He'd stood beside a horse, gripping a sack of Bibles, mouth sewn shut, heart hammering, watching Lieutenant Carter laugh as he tipped over a cooking fire and dragged a man by his braids into the open. He'd heard the crying, the begging, the silence after, and when the screaming started, he hadn't tried to stop it. He'd run, dropped the sack, let the word of God tumble into the dirt, and ran like the coward his father had once warned him never to become. Now here he was, walking the same path in reverse, stepping over bones he'd never meant to see again. He glanced at Tohana, her back rigid, her breath even. She hadn't looked at him once. He wondered if she knew if she'd smelled it on him the moment she found him in the riverbed. Guilt had a scent, didn't it? Like sweat and gunpowder. I didn't know. He whispered, the words shriveling in the heat. I didn't. His voice trailed off when they reached a circle of stones, 6 bodies laid out beneath the open sky. Arms crossed over their chests, eyes gone to dust. Each one wrapped in what remained of ceremonial cloth, though some had only scorched blankets. Tohana knelt beside the smallest one, no bigger than a sleeping lamb, and brushed a strand of singed hair from its skull. She didn't cry. Wes wanted her to. He needed her to cry so he could believe there was still some softness left in her. But she didn't. She stood, dusted her hands on her thighs, and walked on. Wes followed, but every step grew heavier, the sun beating harder, the ghosts louder. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but now he knew it didn't matter. He was there. He didn't stop it. And in this place, silence was just another kind of weapon. The path narrowed until it broke against the lip of a ravine, where the wind blew dry and sharp, and the cries of circling crows carved ragged lines across the sky. The earth here was softer, disturbed, broken in the way ground only as when death has recently passed through it. Tohana stopped without warning and stood still, gaze fixed on a patch of dirt where stones had been arranged in a rough oval. Wes lingered behind her, chest tight, every instinct telling him not to ask, not to speak, not to breathe too loud. She dropped to her knees and began to dig, not violently, but with practiced care, like someone peeling bandages off a wound that would never fully close. The earth came away in clumps under her strong hands, revealing blackened cloth, fragments of ash-covered leather, and then bone curved and white, kissed by fire, too large for a child, too slight for a warrior. Wes felt his stomach twist when she lifted the femur, still wrapped in a scrap of scorched cloth painted with faded medicine symbols. Her brother's. She held it in both hands, staring at it not with tears but with a hollow reverence, as if expecting it to speak. Wes took a step closer, drawn despite the dread rising in his throat. Tohana turned to him then, eyes unreadable, and extended the bone. He hesitated. She didn't repeat the gesture, just waited. He stepped forward and took it with both hands, the weight of it unfamiliar, sacred. It was warm from her touch, light as driftwood, but heavier than any guilt he'd ever carried. His fingers trembled. "Who was he?" he asked, barely above a whisper. She didn't look at him. Her voice was cold even. He mixed root for fevers. He sang to the dying. He never held a weapon. The wind stirred around them, kicking grit into his eyes. And they burned him anyway. Wes looked down at the bone in his hands. It didn't feel like evidence. It felt like judgment. He wanted to let it go, but his hands wouldn't obey. Something about holding it, touching it, made the air different, made time stall. He thought of the soldier who'd laughed as flames took the tents, the men who'd called it a cleansing, the preacher who said the Lord moved through fire. Lies. All of them. Tohana didn't shout, didn't weep. She sat back on her heels, hands on her thighs, breathing slow, deep, as if restraining something ancient and vast that lived in her chest. Wes knelt without thinking, and gently placed the bone back in the shallow grave. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though it sounded pathetic in the canyon's open mouth. She looked at him then, not with forgiveness, but with acknowledgement. Her rage had cooled to something sharper, quieter, ice that didn't melt. He understood now this wasn't revenge. Not really. This was a pilgrimage, a reckoning, and she'd brought him here not to punish, but to make him carry it, to feel the weight, to understand what silence and cowardice had cost. As she began to cover the grave, again with handfuls of dry earth, Wes helped her. It felt strange, sacred, wrong and somehow right. Dust clung to his skin like guilt refusing to be washed away. When they finished, she placed a flat stone atop the mound and whispered something in her own tongue. Then she stood, turned without a word, and began to walk. Wes followed, his legs unsteady beneath the burden now inside him, and the wind carried the sound of crows into the distance like a fading prayer. The canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, jagged red walls rising on either side, streaked with age and shadow, the wind moving through it with the hush of breath held too long. Tohana stopped beneath a stone arch where soot-black symbols marked the rock, faded by rain but not forgotten. She motioned for Wes to sit, and he obeyed without question, legs folding beneath him on the sun-baked stone. His throat was dry, heart pounding as if sensing something ancient coiling around them. She said nothing at first, just knelt beside a bundle and drew out a bowl carved from bone, inside it a mixture of ash and something darker, thicker, gleaming red in the waning light. Her fingers dipped into the paste, and she began to mark his chest slowly, with deliberate strokes. First a broken circle over his heart, then a jagged line down the sternum, then 2 slashes across his shoulders like wings clipped. The mixture was cold, smelled of iron and smoke. Wes didn't flinch. Not this time. She rose and built the fire next. No flint, no matches, just friction, spark, dry bark, and breath. The flames rose fast, orange tongues lashing at the dusk, smoke spiraling upward like ghosts returning home. She sat across from him, her voice low and flat. If you want to walk with life, you must carry death first. Then she placed a burning sprig of sage in a clay dish between them and leaned forward, chanting in a voice that sounded older than the canyon walls. The smoke thickened. Wes inhaled reflexively and choked. It wasn't just fire and sage. It was something deeper, more primal, like breathing in memory. His lungs seized. Tears sprang to his eyes. The heat became unbearable. The sky melted into color and flicker. The world tipped. And then visions. Not dreams, not imagination, but truths stitched into the smoke. He saw the massacre again, not through his eyes, but through the eyes of those who burned. He felt the raw terror of Tohana's brother as he clutched a medicine pouch and whispered to a sky that gave no answer. He felt the boot crush his hand. He heard the hiss of fire as it devoured the tent canvas. Then he saw himself, Wes Calder, standing behind the wagon, blank-eyed, frozen, his lips moving but saying nothing. A boy wearing God's name like armor but empty inside. And then he was running, again and again, always running, always looking back, always too late. He screamed, but the sound curled back into his throat. The fire roared louder, or maybe it was blood in his ears. Hands reached from the smoke, small hands, burned hands, hands that tugged at his shirt and begged him not to forget. He gasped, collapsed, darkness swallowing everything but the echo of breath and flame. When he awoke, the fire was ash, the canyon quiet. The sun had barely crested the ridgeline, gold light spilling across stone like a benediction. He sat up slowly, his body aching, and found the paint still streaked across his chest and hands, dried and cracked. Tohana was gone. No sign of her footsteps, no sound. Just him and the painted stones and the fire's grave. He looked down at his palms, smeared with blood and ash, and felt a weight settle into him, not crushing, but anchoring. Something had changed. Not washed away, not forgiven, but named. And now, for the first time, he knew it could never be undone. The sun rode high by the time Wes stumbled into the clearing, a narrow stretch of earth where the wind had peeled the trees back into a circle, and there, draped mockingly over a twisted juniper branch, hung the soldier's jacket. His jacket, blue wool, brass buttons dulled with soot, one sleeve torn at the elbow, the fabric stiff with dried sweat and dust. It fluttered faintly in the breeze like a flag over a conquered place, and for a long moment, Wes just stared at it, unmoving. His legs were shaking from the climb, breath still ragged from whatever had passed through him in that canyon of smoke and blood. The wind rustled again, and the jacket swayed, casting a long, crooked shadow that pointed directly at him. He stepped closer, heart thudding, throat tight, and reached out a trembling hand. His fingers brushed the collar, and in a flash, memory struck like a hammer Reverend Doyle's voice, slick with righteousness, asterisk. They're not people the way we are, son. They ain't got souls like ours. God made them wild for a reason. Asterisk laughter. The soldiers around the campfire, warm and full-bellied, passing whiskey while the boy, the healer, Tohana's brother, stood trembling, his palms raised, speaking broken English. Asterisk. No fire. No fight. Just food. Medicine. Asterisk, more laughter. A shove. Someone had spit at his feet. Wes remembered looking down at the pages of the Bible in his lap, trying to read, pretending he didn't see the rifle being loaded. Asterisk. Preach if you want, Calder, but don't get in the way of justice. Asterisk, justice. He'd believed it then, or pretended to. Now, standing beneath the sun with the sweat drying on his skin and the ash still crusted on his chest, he felt something he'd never felt before, not fear, not confusion, not guilt, but rage. Pure, clean. A spark lit deep in his gut, and this time, he didn't run from it. He yanked the jacket from the branch and held it up like it was a snake he finally recognized. He turned it in his hands, saw the stitch where his name had once been. now worn smooth by wind. Then he threw it to the ground and stomped it once, twice, grinding it into the dirt. His breath hitched, chest burning, and he dropped to his knees beside the dying campfire that Tohana must have left for him. He fed the jacket in, piece by piece, ripping the seams, peeling the cloth apart like a skin he no longer wanted. It burned slow, stubborn, the smoke curling upward with a stink like old sweat and gunpowder. He didn't look away. He watched it blacken, curl, vanish. And as the last scrap turned to ember, something inside him broke. No, not broke. Released. The uniform hadn't been armor. It had been blindness, stitched into place by obedience. Now it was ash. He sat back, blinking smoke from his eyes, hands filthy, chest bare. He was no longer Private Wesley Calder. That name belonged to the boy who'd watched and stayed silent, who'd let evil wear God's face and called it mercy. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be him hiding behind buttons and brass. Whatever came next, it would be him, raw and wrong and learning. The fire hissed. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the trees, a hawk called out, and for the first time, Wes didn't flinch. Wes heard them before. He saw them heavy boots dragging through grit, the sharp clink of metal on metal, and the slow, deliberate breath of a woman walking behind death. He turned toward the sound, heart-seizing, and there she was, Tohana, emerging from the trees like a storm-given shape, one hand gripping a length of rawhide rope, the other steady on the hilt of her tomahawk. Bound by the neck and stumbling behind her came a cavalry lieutenant, his once bright uniform dark with dried blood and filth, one eye swollen shut, mouth twisted into a snarl even through the cracked lips. Wes recognized him immediately, Lieutenant Harrow, the man who'd stood tall during the raid, shouting orders with the calm of a butcher. Harrow had dragged women from their tents, had laughed when the healer boy begged, had pressed the muzzle of a pistol into a child's face and said, "Asterisk, we'll save the bullets for men." Asterisk, Wes's blood turned to ice. Tohana marched the lieutenant into the clearing, shoved him to his knees, and dropped the tomahawk into Wes's lap without a word. It landed with a thud that echoed like thunder in his chest. "You saw what he did," she said, voice flat. The lieutenant spat at the ground, then up at Wes. "You little rat," he hissed. "We fed you, paid you. You think she's not going to slit your throat next?" Wes stared at him, heart hammering, throat dry. His hands closed around the weapon's handle, the weight of it familiar now, frightening. He stepped closer. Harrow looked smaller on his knees, human but no less monstrous. Wes's breath quickened. Behind his eyes, the images returned firelight on blood. Children screaming, the girl who reached for help as she burned. He raised the tomahawk. The wind held its breath. But then he saw his own reflection in the blade, face twisted, eyes full of vengeance, no longer a boy but not yet something better. His hand trembled. He saw Harrow's sneer, saw Tohana watching silently, her gaze hard but not unkind. Then he let the tomahawk fall not into flesh, but into the dirt. "I won't be like him," he said, voice breaking. "Not this way." Harrow laughed, a wet, broken sound. "You ain't got the stones." But Wes didn't look at him. He looked at Tohana. She didn't smile, didn't offer comfort, just stepped forward and, without ceremony, slit Harrow's throat with a bone knife pulled from her belt. It was fast, a single motion, no cruelty, no hesitation. He slumped forward, gurgled once, and was gone. Wes flinched but didn't turn away. The blood soaked into the soil, dark and silent. Tohana stood over the body, still as stone, then crouched beside the fire and pulled out a shovel wrapped in deerskin. She handed it to Wes, her eyes locking with his. No words, just the weight of expectation. This was not about death, it was about what came after. About what a man did when blood had already been spilled. Wes took the shovel. He dug. The ground was hard, full of roots and rocks, and the sun bore down like judgment. But he didn't stop. Not until the hole was deep enough to hold the man who'd burned a village and laughed. Not until the sweat had soaked through his trousers and his arms ached with penance. When it was done, he stood over the grave, chest heaving, hands blistered. Tohana placed a single stone atop the mound, then turned and walked into the dusk. Wes followed, leaving behind not just a body but a version of himself he'd never returned to. The fire crackled low between them, throwing soft amber light onto their faces as night folded gently over the land like a prayer whispered too late. The canyon winds had quieted, leaving only the hush of embers and the distant call of night birds. And in that silence, something shifted, not the weight of grief, not entirely, but the space where grief and understanding began to braid together. Tohana sat cross-legged, hands resting on her knees, eyes fixed on the flames. Her war paint had faded to smudges, her braids loose over her shoulders, and for the first time, she looked less like a warrior and more like someone who remembered how to be a sister. "He used to hum when he worked," she said suddenly, voice low and rough with memory. "Always some melody he made up. Said the plants listened better when you sang to them." She stared into the fire like she could see him there, kneeling with herbs, laughing when the wind tangled his hair. He was never meant to die like that. He was meant to heal, not burn. Wes said nothing at first, afraid words might break the moment. But then he found his voice, softer than he expected. "I was never meant to carry a rifle," he said. "My mama wanted me behind a pulpit, said my hands were too kind for war." He held them out, palms up, calloused and cracked. "But I carried their Bibles, followed their flags, and watched them burn your brother." Tohana looked at him then, not with anger, but with something gentler, older. "Then maybe your path changed for a reason." She reached out and placed her fingers gently on his chest, over the cracked line of paint still faded from the ritual. Her touch wasn't tender, nor harsh. It was grounding, ceremonial, like pressing a seal into wax. "Now you carry two spirits," she said. "His and yours. You'll never walk clean again, but you'll walk right." The words settled into him like stone beneath water, rippling inward. He felt something, crack not break, but open deep in his chest. Grief, yes, but also gratitude. Not for what had happened, but for what had been survived. They sat there for a while longer, letting the silence speak. The fire popped. Wes looked up at the stars bleeding silver above them and wondered if the boy who once prayed beside his mother's bed could still exist inside the man who now knew how blood smelled in dirt. "What now?" he asked quietly. Tohana leaned back, eyes half-lidded. "Now we walk, until there's something worth building." She didn't promise hope. She didn't offer healing. But what she gave was something firmer: direction. A path carved by fire, lit by memory. The night deepened around them, but Wes didn't feel lost. He felt changed. Not saved, not redeemed, but seen. The fire burned low, but neither of them moved to feed it. Some things, after all, were meant to die so they could be carried. And when the last spark faded into ash, they rose together and walked into the dark, side by side, not as enemies, not even as friends, but as two people bound by a truth no sermon could ever speak. The sun cracked the horizon like a slow breath, warming a long dead earth, spilling gold over the ridges and painting the desert in soft fire. Wes stood at the base of the rise, one hand on the reins of a painted horse whose coat shimmered with streaks of white and chestnut, its flanks dusted from the canyon winds. He looked different now, his face still young, but the softness stripped away, jaw firmer, eyes steadier, bearing not the weight of guilt alone but the quiet strength of a man who's chosen to carry it. The ash and blood markings on his chest had faded, but he could still feel them, like fingerprints pressed into his ribs, reminders of everything buried and everything left behind. Tohana stood above him on the rocky ledge, arms crossed, her silhouette sharp against the morning sky, the same wind that stirred his horse's mane tugging gently at her braids. She didn't call out, didn't wave, just watched with the stillness of someone who understood what parting meant. Wes met her gaze and nodded once, something between gratitude and goodbye. She tilted her head slightly, and her voice came down the slope, dry as flint but edged with something almost playful. "You were never a virgin," she said, and a ghost of a smirk played at the edge of her mouth. "Only untouched by truth." The words hit him like a blessing and a warning in one, and he let them settle in the air as he mounted the horse and pulled the reins gently. The animal snorted, then began to walk, hooves crunching over gravel as they turned westward toward a town he had once passed through unnoticed, where a chapel stood half-finished, and a preacher's voice still echoed in a hollow building full of polished lies. But this time he wasn't bringing books. This time, he brought stories. The ones no one wanted to tell, the ones with burned cradles and red soil, with warriors who wept without sound, with boys who became men only when they chose not to raise the blade. He didn't know what he'd say when he got there, or if they'd even listen, but he knew this. Silence was no longer an option. Behind him, Tohana turned without ceremony and disappeared into the rocks, vanishing like smoke, like memory, leaving only the wind and the fire's ghost. That wind rose suddenly, lifting a swirl of ash from the burial mound they'd left beneath the juniper, scattering it skyward like a final prayer or a warning carried to the gods. Wes didn't look back. The horse picked up its pace. The mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and waiting, and beyond them, uncertainty. Maybe justice, maybe more blood. The trail would be long, but he would ride it. Not clean, but right. And as the camera pulls back, if there were a camera, the dust behind him rises into morning light, and the screen fades slowly to the shimmer of heat and horizon. A voice remains, soft but clear. Not his, not hers. Maybe ours. Asterisk. And what would you have done if it were your bone in his hand? Asterisk.